For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Political analyst Aubrey Majiqi discusses foreign policy between the DA and the ANC. Can you explain how the two rounds of foreign policy we witnessed earlier this year of the Democratic Alliance leader Mmusi Maimane's visit to Israel, as well as when Tshwane Mayor Solly Msimang visited Taiwan in his capacity, are not about foreign policy, but about changing balance of political power between the ruling party and the DA?
Well, actually, when I was preparing for this interview, I thought I left one word in that sentence. They are not only about foreign policy. They are also about the changing or shifting balance of power and support between the ANC and the DA. Now, the DA feels quite bullish about having one of its mayors going to Taiwan and its leader going to Israel, because they're beginning to project themselves as a government of the future. And they're projecting themselves because of the outcome of the August 3 elections last year. So they see themselves as a government in waiting. If you look at it that way, the two rows about Solly Msimang going to Taiwan and Mmusi Maimane going to Israel, going against South Africa's foreign policy position, I think are an indication of what we can expect from a DA government when it comes to that government's orientation towards foreign policy issues.
As a political analyst, Aubrey, were you expecting the ANC's grievances following the visits?
Well, if you remember, we became aware of Solly Msimang's visit to Taiwan much earlier than the time of the explosion from the side of the ANC criticizing Msimang for the visit. Which means the possibility is that because it happened around the period of the festive season, the ANC communication section was asleep, was in hibernation because of the festive season. And the reason you have this delayed response is because then workers in the communication department are back at work. And one of the things on their in-tray was Solly Msimang's visit to Taiwan. But I also think it was a bit of political theater, because the aim of the ANC, I think, was to project the DA as being reactionary, to the extent that the one China policy is deemed by some to be progressive. Now, of course, whether it is progressive or not is in dispute, but what we can agree on or about is the fact that it's a pragmatic position. In other words, South Africa, given a choice between Taiwan and China, was always going to go with China for pragmatic reasons. But there's also ideology here. The two rows betray an ideological tension between the ANC and the DA, particularly when you look at the issue of Israel. The ANC, given its history in the liberation struggle and how during the liberation struggle it was closer to the Palestinians, and therefore, even when it argues in favor of a two-state solution, its bias is towards the Palestinians, and it criticizes the Israeli government for the occupation of the Palestinian areas. Now, Mmusi Maimane, by going to Israel in the manner that he did, takes the opposite view, or takes the opposite position. So in that case, you're not dealing just with a foreign policy tension. You're also dealing with an ideological tension. The same applies to China to some extent, because the ANC regards itself as a force of the left, and therefore not siding with China and having a bias towards Taiwan would be a betrayal of its left-wing impulses, whereas the DA does not have that problem, because its impulses are not left-wing, they are right-wing.
Aubrey, in your column, you also mentioned that the DA and the ANC are on the same page about the fact that a commitment to democracy and a human right is critical, but there are deep disagreements between the two parties about what that means. Can you elaborate on those disagreements?
In 1993, Nelson Mandela wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs magazine in which he was articulating the foreign policy position of a future ANC government, given the fact that this happened about a year before the 1994 elections. And one of the key pillars he articulated was that of human rights, justice, democracy. There was therefore an expectation that an ANC government would put much more emphasis on human rights, democracy, and justice than on the national interest defined in pragmatic terms. Or to put it differently, there was an expectation that, given the fact that the ANC came from a particular history, a history of struggle against colonialism and apartheid, and Nelson Mandela symbolized certain values and principles, the ANC government would attach itself to idealist conceptions of international relations and foreign policy, not to realist conceptions of international relations and foreign policy, because realist conceptions of foreign policy are about self-interest. So faced with a foreign policy decision, a country must ask itself what is in the national interest of that country. To put it even more simply, a country does not ask the question, what is the right thing to do? It asks itself, what is the pragmatic thing to do? And in posing the question that way, we have found the ANC, for instance, on the question of Myanmar, you know, the ANC voting against a human rights position and getting nailed by other countries as a result. But foreign policy is messy, is contradictory. And international relations, if we must talk about international relations as in terms of the moral high ground, the moral high ground is a vacant plot. No country occupies the moral high ground, even those that scream democracy, human rights, and justice the loudest, especially those who are permanent members of the UN. None of them can speak credibly about occupying the moral high ground.
Why do you say that the DA's visit to Israel was a product of ambiguous legacy?
Well, you know, if you bring yourself back to domestic issues and you look at the evolution of liberalism in South Africa. So there's a time when its precursors, such as the Liberal Party, the Progressive Party, and so on, are anti-apartheid, yes, but are not in favor of black majority rule. They're in favor of things such as the qualified franchise. So there's a time in the evolution of liberalism in South Africa where the ancestors of the DA are opposed to apartheid, but are not in favor of one man, one vote, if it means the result is going to be black majority rule. So they came with policy perspectives such as the qualified franchise, where, for instance, if you were black, you would have the vote if you had achieved a certain level of education, or you owned land, and so on. Or as they said in those days in KwaZulu-Natal, if you were exempted. And exempted, the word comes from exemption. Educated blacks had a passbook that was green in color, whereas the rest was brown. And that gave educated blacks certain rights. Now, according to the ancestors of the DA, Amazemtiti then would have qualified for the vote, whereas blacks were not educated, who did not own land, and so on, would not have qualified for the vote. So that ambiguous legacy, if you throw forward to where we are today, finds expression, for instance, in the DA's attitude towards redress. Issues such as affirmative action, black economic empowerment, employment equity, the land question. The DA still remains ambiguous when it comes to those issues. And that ambiguous legacy, if the DA finds itself being a ruling party one day, I think will find expression in foreign policy too.
Do you think that the differences between the DA and the ANC can be resolved when it comes to foreign policy?
It is said that politics is the art of the possible, and revolution is the art of the impossible. It is possible for the DA and the ANC to find one another on foreign policy, but it is highly unlikely. I think ideologically, they are on two different planets, unless the ANC changes so much that the realignment that occurs internally produces a right-wing impulse. And because of that right-wing impulse, in foreign policy positions, the ANC shifts to the left. But it can be argued that some of the foreign policy positions the ANC has adopted have been reactionary and regressive. And the question, therefore, is it because when that happens, the ANC is suffering an erosion of its progressive impulses? Or is it because pragmatically it has to make unpopular foreign policy positions sometimes in order to pursue its national interest? Now, those of us who believe in the idealist conception of international relations believe that the ANC government, or any government for that matter, must err on the side of human rights, democracy, and justice. But in the day-to-day practice of foreign policy, the question is whether that is always possible.
As a political analyst, what do you make of the US President Donald Trump's telephone conversation with our President Jacob Zuma?
Well, President Trump has said terrible things, both about the continent and South Africa. But you will remember that in the State of the Nation address, the president was quite conciliatory towards the US and President Trump. I think what the South African government has decided to do in pursuit of the national interest as it understands it is to look beyond Trump and put emphasis on the traditional relationship between South Africa and the US. And you will remember that there have been doubts about whether Trump will continue or will support AGOA or will ask the US to pull out of the AGOA arrangement. I think in anticipation of that policy, the South African government has decided to go on a charm offensive. And if the call between Trump and Zuma is anything to go by, it would suggest that either Trump has realized that despite what he said on the campaign trail, South Africa and Nigeria remain two of the key and anchor countries on the continent, and that if he has to deal with the continent in any way, he can't do so without dealing with South Africa and Nigeria. So the call may have been about Trump's own pragmatism in response to Jacob Zuma's pragmatism when the South African government decides to look beyond Trump and focus more on the traditional relationship between the US and South Africa.
That was political analyst Aubrey Majiki speaking to Crema Media's Polity about foreign policy between the DA and the ANC.